What would you do if the person you loved most hid a dark secret that could tear your world apart? This is the haunting story of Brendan Banfield, a man with a good job, a beautiful family, and a dark side no one could see. On the outside, Brendan seemed to be living the perfect life. He had a successful career as an IRS special agent, a caring wife, Christine, and a young daughter who adored him. But behind closed doors, he was living a double life, a web of lies and deceit that would eventually lead to tragedy. His affair with the family's young nanny, Juliana Peres Magalhães, would become more than just a betrayal. It would ignite a deadly series of events that ended in murder. How far would you go to keep a secret? And how long can someone hide the truth before it all comes crashing down? This story reveals the shocking lengths Brendan went to in order to be with his lover and the devastating price that was paid. Christine Banfield was more than just a wife and mother. She was the heart of the family. A warm, loving woman, she worked as a pediatric nurse, dedicating her days to caring for sick children and comforting their worried parents. She was known for her kindness and patience, and those who knew her said she had a natural ability to put others at ease. Her family and her work were everything to her, and she took pride in both. Friends described Christine as a person who always had a smile on her face, a woman with a giving spirit who would do anything for the people she loved. Brendan, her husband, was a respected IRS special agent. With a career in federal law enforcement, Brendan was seen as a man of integrity and responsibility. He was quiet and reserved, the kind of person who seemed steady and dependable. To those around him, Brendan appeared to be a devoted family man, someone who took his responsibilities seriously. In public, Brendan and Christine seemed to have it all of a stable home, a loving marriage, and a beautiful daughter who was the light of their lives. Their neighbors and friends admired them, seeing them as a model family in their suburban community. But while Christine was completely dedicated to her family, Brendan was not. Behind his composed exterior, Brendan hid a restless heart. Despite the life he'd built with Christine, something was missing, something he was willing to risk everything to find. Little did anyone know that Brendan's need for excitement and attention would lead him down a dark path, one that would destroy his family and end in unthinkable violence. Juliana Peres Magalhães came into the Banfield family's life as an au pair, a young woman full of dreams and excitement for a new life in America. She was 22 years old, fresh-faced, and eager to experience the world. Coming from Brazil, Juliana saw her role with the Banfield family as an opportunity to learn English, explore a new culture, and build a future for herself. At first, she was just there to take care of the Banfield's daughter, helping around the house and occasionally joining them for family outings. Christine, always trusting and open-hearted, welcomed Juliana into their home without hesitation. She treated Juliana as part of the family, inviting her to dinners, including her in conversations, and making sure she felt comfortable. Christine never saw Juliana as a threat, just a young woman far from home who needed a place to belong. But to Brendan, Juliana was more than just the family's helper. She was a temptation he couldn't resist. Brendan and Juliana quickly developed a rapport. At first, it was harmless. They'd chat in passing, share a laugh here and there. But over time, the conversations became longer, the glances lingered, and the boundaries blurred. The two grew close in a way that was inappropriate, but they hid it well. Juliana began to fill the emotional gap that Brendan felt in his life, and soon the innocent au pair became the center of his attention. Christine had no idea that the person she'd welcomed into her family would become the very reason it all fell apart. Brendan and Juliana's friendship was crossing lines, and soon it became something much darker. Their relationship started with whispers, subtle glances, and stolen moments. What began as innocent flirtation grew into something intense, a relationship that couldn't stay hidden for long. The affair developed in secret, with Brendan and Juliana becoming increasingly reckless. They'd meet when Christine wasn't around, using every opportunity to spend time together. For Brendan, Juliana was everything he felt he'd been missing. She was young, lively, and completely infatuated with him. And for Juliana, Brendan was someone who offered stability, security, and the thrill of a forbidden relationship. Their stolen glances turned into late-night conversations, and those conversations turned into secret rendezvous. Each time they met, they took bigger risks, their passion for each other fueling their desire to escape the confines of their hidden relationship. Brendan knew he was walking a dangerous line, but he was intoxicated by the thrill of it all. The two of them felt unstoppable, invincible, like nothing and no one could stand in their way. But as the affair grew, so did their frustration with the life they were forced to hide. Brendan became increasingly resentful of Christine, seeing her as the only barrier between him and his new life with Juliana. The thought of leaving Christine became less of a fantasy and more of a necessity in his mind. Their affair wasn't just a fleeting passion, it was a toxic obsession. Brendan wanted Juliana all to himself, and she wanted the same. But the only way for them to truly be together was to get rid of Christine. And so the idea of murder crept into their conversations, slowly at first, until it became their only solution. They convinced themselves that Christine's death would solve everything, that once she was gone, they'd be free to live the life they wanted. It was a dangerous fantasy, one that they believed they could make real. Once they'd made the decision to kill Christine, Brendan and Juliana threw themselves into planning. They knew this couldn't be a spur-of-the-moment crime. It needed to be perfect, meticulously executed, so that no one would suspect them. The plan they came up with was simple but brutal. They decided to stage Christine's murder as a home invasion gone wrong. By making it look like a random act of violence, they believed they could escape suspicion and move on with their lives without consequence. They discussed every detail, imagining every possible scenario. Brendan, with his background in law enforcement, knew how important it was to avoid leaving any trace of their involvement. They talked about how to manipulate the scene, what alibis they'd need, and even how they'd act in front of the police. Juliana, eager to please Brendan and desperate to be with him, followed his lead without question. She was completely under his control, ready to do whatever it took to be by his side. As they continued plotting, they realized they needed a scapegoat, someone they could frame for the crime. That's when Brendan thought of Joe Ryan, a family friend who often visited the house. Joe was unsuspecting and had no reason to suspect he was being drawn into a trap. Brendan and Juliana believed that if they could get Joe involved, it would add another layer to their cover story, making it even harder for the police to see the truth. Their plan was cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of remorse. They believed that if they stuck to their script, no one would ever suspect them. Joe Ryan was an innocent man, a friendly, outgoing person who had no idea what Brendan and Juliana were planning. He was a trusted family friend, someone who would have done anything for the Banfields. Brendan saw Joe as the perfect target, a person they could use to make their staged break-in look more believable. Joe was the final piece of their twisted puzzle, a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. To set the trap, Brendan created a fake online profile, pretending to be someone interested in meeting Joe. Under this guise, he lured Joe to the house, making him believe he was coming to meet someone new. Joe, having no reason to suspect anything, agreed, believing he was simply going to meet a new friend. But for Brendan and Juliana, this was all part of their scheme. Joe's presence in the house would be used to support their alibi, a witness to back up their story of a violent intruder who broke into their home. When the day came, Joe walked into the Banfield home completely unaware of the danger he was in. He was greeted by Brendan, who led him inside, carefully setting the stage for the crime that was about to unfold. Joe thought he was meeting a friend, but he was walking into a trap that had been carefully laid out by people he thought he could trust. Brendan and Juliana's plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. The perfect life they had imagined was within reach if only they could pull off the murder that would make it possible. The day of the crime dawned like any other, with an eerie calm hanging over the Banfield household. Brendan and Juliana moved through their routines like actors, preparing for their roles in a dark drama. Everything had to go exactly as planned. Any misstep could unravel their carefully constructed alibi. They'd rehearsed each move, planned every detail. In their minds, this was the day their new life would finally begin. As Joe Ryan arrived at the Banfield house, he was completely unaware of the sinister plot waiting for him. Brendan greeted him at the door, keeping up the facade of a friendly, welcoming host. Joe entered the house with no idea that he was walking into a deadly trap. Inside, Juliana was waiting, playing her part as the distressed au pair, terrified of the intruder who would soon arrive. Brendan and Juliana exchanged glances, a silent signal that everything was ready. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment when their plan would be set in motion. For Brendan and Juliana, it was now or never. They'd already crossed so many lines, committed so many betrayals. There was no turning back. Joe would be the unwitting witness to Christine's death, a pawn in their twisted game. As Brendan and Juliana prepared for the final act, the house filled with a sense of impending doom, as if it knew the horror that was about to unfold. They believed they were in control, that everything would go according to plan, but fate, as they would soon discover, had other ideas. Christine was in the kitchen when it happened, unaware of the danger lurking just around the corner. In her mind, this was just another day, filled with the usual routines and responsibilities. She didn't know that Brendan and Juliana were in the next room, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Brendan approached her, his face a mask of calm. As Christine turned to greet him, he made his move. With one swift, brutal motion, he attacked her, stabbing her in the neck. The blow was quick and fatal, designed to silence her forever. In that instant, Christine's life ended, and Brendan's betrayal reached its horrifying climax. Juliana watched as Brendan carried out the act, her expression cold and unfeeling. This was what they'd planned for, what they believed would solve all their problems. But as Christine lay lifeless, a sense of dread began to creep in. This wasn't just an act of passion, it was a calculated, ruthless murder. The reality of what they'd done was starting to sink in, but there was no time for regret. They had to move fast to complete their cover-up. They set to work, manipulating the scene to look like a violent break-in. They overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and staged the room to make it look like an intruder had been in a struggle with Christine. Every detail was carefully arranged, from the positioning of her body to the placement of the weapon. To the untrained eye, it would look like Christine had been a victim of a random act of violence. But Brendan and Juliana didn't realize that they were leaving behind clues, small mistakes that would eventually reveal the truth. Joe had been waiting in the living room, completely unaware of what had just happened in the kitchen. In his mind, he was simply there to meet a friend, to spend a few hours in the company of people he trusted. But Brendan and Juliana had other plans. Joe was the final piece of their puzzle, the unfortunate witness who would be caught in the crossfire of their scheme. For their alibi to work, Joe couldn't leave the house alive. Brendan approached Joe under the pretense of casual conversation, leading him into a position where he'd have the upper hand. In one swift move, Brendan pulled out a gun and fired. Joe didn't stand a chance. The first shot hit him in the chest and the second went straight to his head. It was over in seconds. Joe, the unsuspecting friend, became an unwitting victim in their plan. With Joe dead, Brendan and Juliana felt a twisted sense of relief. The hardest part was over. They believed they'd removed any witnesses, covered their tracks, and ensured their story would hold up under scrutiny. But as they surveyed the scene, they failed to notice the small details, the things they'd overlooked in their haste. The crime scene was set, but it wasn't as flawless as they thought. Juliana made the 911 call, her voice trembling with feigned panic as she described the horrific scene unfolding in the house. She told the dispatcher that an intruder had broken in, attacked Christine, and killed Joe in a brutal struggle. Her words painted a vivid picture of chaos, fear, and violence. She cried, adding the right amount of emotion to make it sound convincing, every word rehearsed to sell the story they'd created. As emergency responders rushed to the house, Brendan and Juliana rehearsed their alibi, one last time. They knew they'd be questioned, that their story would have to withstand scrutiny. When the police arrived, they found the house in disarray, just as Brendan and Juliana had planned. To the untrained eye, it looked like the aftermath of a violent break-in. The officers took Juliana's statement, noting her shaky voice, her apparent distress. For the moment it seemed like their story would hold, but there was something unsettling about the scene, something that didn't quite add up. The officers couldn't put their finger on it, but they sensed that something was off. As they began their initial investigation, small inconsistencies started to surface, details that didn't fit with the story Brendan and Juliana had told. The truth was beginning to peek through the cracks in their carefully constructed lie. As investigators combed through the house, they noticed subtle signs that something was amiss. The scene seemed staged, as if someone had gone to great lengths to make it look like a break-in. The overturned furniture looked too deliberate, the scattered belongings too neatly arranged. The officers on the scene were seasoned professionals, trained to spot details that others might miss. And as they examined the evidence, a picture began to form, one that didn't match the story Brendan and Juliana had told. They examined the blood spatter patterns, noting that they didn't align with the supposed struggle. The positioning of Christine's body suggested something more calculated, less chaotic than a random attack, and Joe's body, positioned as if he'd been caught in the crossfire, seemed oddly out of place. Each clue, each piece of evidence told a story of its own, one that contradicted the home invasion narrative. As detectives interviewed Brendan and Juliana, they took note of their behavior. Brendan appeared calm, too calm for a man who had just lost his wife and friend in such a brutal way. Juliana's tears, while convincing on the surface, seemed forced, almost rehearsed. The investigators sensed that there was more to the story, that the real truth was hiding just beneath the surface. They began to dig deeper, determined to uncover what really happened in the Banfield home that day. As the forensic team got to work, they began to notice details that just didn't add up. Blood spatter, usually chaotic in violent struggles, seemed too controlled, too deliberate. In one room, the blood pattern suggested an attack from a single direction, no sign of the kind of frenzy expected in a real break-in. Detectives examined the patterns carefully, making notes and exchanging glances, aware that these small, overlooked details were often the key to solving cases. Even the positions of Christine and Joe's bodies raised questions. Christine lay as though she'd been taken completely by surprise, while Joe's body, positioned as if he'd walked in on the intruder, seemed staged. The investigators noted the lack of defensive wounds on either Christine or Joe, unusual if they had been struggling to defend themselves. The inconsistencies were piling up, creating a stark contrast to the story Brendan and Juliana had told. Detectives could sense the truth was buried somewhere in the details, and they were determined to uncover it. Beyond the blood patterns, other details caught their attention. They found small disturbances in areas that should have been untouched, fingerprints where there shouldn't have been any, and even footprints that seemed out of place. The break-in was starting to look like an illusion, crafted by someone who thought they could manipulate the scene. For Brendan and Juliana, the cracks in their story were growing, and the evidence was beginning to tell its own version of events. As detectives continued their investigation, they started piecing together the fragments of Brendan and Juliana's secret relationship. Neighbors who'd occasionally noticed the way Brendan and Juliana looked at each other now began to come forward with stories of subtle flirtations and suspicious interactions. One neighbor even recalled seeing them together late one night, their behavior too intimate for just an employer and his au pair. The small rumors spread quickly, becoming a focal point of the investigation. A turning point came when detectives searched Brendan's phone and found encrypted messages between him and Juliana. The texts spoke of secret meetings, whispered promises, and their plans for a future together. But there was more. In some messages, the two discussed removing obstacles and being together without anyone in their way. The detectives knew they'd hit a goldmine of evidence. The affair wasn't just a random fling, It was a calculated, all-consuming obsession that drove them to unimaginable lengths. Investigators also uncovered photos, candid shots of the two in intimate moments, hidden in encrypted folders on Brendan's phone. With each new piece of evidence, the detective's theory became clearer. This wasn't just a tragic accident or a random act of violence. It was a meticulously planned murder, fueled by a forbidden relationship that spiraled out of control. Brendan and Juliana's secret was no longer hidden. It was now the heart of the investigation. With the evidence of the affair mounting, detectives had enough to take action. Juliana was brought in for questioning, and the pressure was on. The young au pair, once so calm and collected, now seemed nervous and anxious. Her rehearsed story began to falter under the detective's questions, her confident demeanor giving way to uncertainty. The detectives pushed her, probing for inconsistencies, watching for cracks in her facade. When detectives confronted her with the texts, the photos, and the mounting forensic evidence, Juliana knew she was cornered. Her voice shook as she tried to explain, but there was no escaping the truth. She was arrested on the spot, charged with second-degree murder in Joe's death. As the handcuffs were placed on her wrists, the reality of her situation set in. She'd crossed lines she could never uncross, and now she was facing the consequences. The community was stunned. The news of Juliana's arrest spread quickly, and people couldn't believe that the sweet, seemingly innocent au pair was capable of such a crime. The media pounced on the story, painting Juliana as the seductive young nanny who had lured a husband away from his wife and convinced him to kill. But as shocking as Juliana's involvement was, investigators knew that she wasn't the only one to blame. The case against Brendan was building, and it was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. Even as Juliana sat in custody, Brendan continued to play the role of the grieving husband. He distanced himself from Juliana, denying any involvement in the crime and insisting that he was just as shocked as everyone else. To those who didn't know him well, he might have seemed convincing, a man blindsided by tragedy, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. But the detectives saw through his act. They knew that Brendan was hiding something, and they were determined to prove it. Brendan tried to weave a story that would place all the blame on Juliana, painting her as a manipulative young woman who had dragged him into an affair against his will. He claimed he'd been seduced and trapped, that he'd had no idea Juliana was planning anything violent, but the detectives weren't buying it. They knew that Brendan was more than just a passive participant. He was the mastermind behind the plan, the one who'd set the wheels in motion. As the investigation continued, Brendan's carefully constructed lies began to unravel. His attempts to deflect suspicion only made him look guiltier. Every lie, every misdirection, only added to the detective's determination to bring him to justice. Brendan may have thought he could outsmart everyone, but he was about to learn that his deception had limits. The walls were closing in, and there was nowhere left to hide. Determined to uncover every detail of the plot, investigators dug even deeper. They searched Brendan's financial records, tracking suspicious transactions that pointed to secret rendezvous and lavish gifts for Juliana. They looked through phone records, finding a pattern of late-night calls and encrypted messages that painted a clear picture of their relationship. The detectives knew they were on the right track, each new piece of evidence strengthening their case. They called in forensic specialists to re-examine the crime scene, looking for anything they might have missed. The experts studied every inch, analyzing every pattern, every mark, every clue. Their work was meticulous, and with each new discovery, the detectives' case grew stronger. Brendan and Juliana's plan, which had once seemed foolproof, was now crumbling under the weight of evidence. One investigator even contacted experts in behavioral analysis, hoping to understand the psychology behind Brendan and Juliana's actions. What drove them to such extremes? What turned a secret affair into a deadly conspiracy? The answers weren't simple, but the experts agreed on one thing. Brendan and Juliana's relationship was toxic, an obsessive bond that blurred the lines between love, control, and destruction. As the detectives pieced together the story, they knew they were closing in on the truth. Finally, after months of work, the The investigators had everything they needed. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive crystal clear. Brendan and Juliana had planned every step, manipulated every detail, and tried to cover up a crime that would have devastated any family. But now their plan lay in ruins, exposed for everyone to see. The detectives had won, and justice was within reach. After months of digging, the investigation reached a pivotal moment. The detectives were ready to present their case, but they needed one last piece of irrefutable evidence to make their case bulletproof. It arrived in the form of a forensic analysis report, confirming Brendan's fingerprints on the very items used to stage the crime scene. But there was more. Forensic analysis on the phone data revealed deleted messages and searches related to criminal techniques and alibi creation. Brendan had been careless in his attempts to cover his tracks, and now his own actions were sealing his fate. With this final piece of evidence, the detectives knew they had what they needed. The messages and searches painted a chilling picture of Brendan's mindset, showing a man meticulously planning his wife's murder with a frightening level of detail. The fingerprints, the deleted messages, and the digital footprint were impossible to ignore. For Brendan, the walls were closing in. Investigators prepared their case, ready to bring Brendan in and hold him accountable for his role in the tragic deaths of Christine and Joe. As the detectives prepared to move forward, Juliana was faced with a choice. Seeing the strength of the evidence against them, she realized her best chance at leniency was to cooperate. She agreed to work with the prosecution, her testimony providing crucial insight into the events leading up to the murders. Her cooperation marked the final nail in Brendan's coffin, setting the stage for a courtroom showdown that would determine his fate. With Juliana's cooperation and the mountain of evidence, the detectives were ready to confront Brendan. They arrived at his office, an unlikely place for the arrest of a man who had once been seen as a respectable IRS agent. The scene was surreal. Brendan, in handcuffs, surrounded by former colleagues who could only watch in stunned silence. His life, once so carefully ordered, was now unraveling in full view of the world. The media caught wind of the arrest almost immediately. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Brendan, always so composed, looked visibly shaken for the first time. He tried to maintain his innocence, insisting he was the victim of a misunderstanding. But the detectives knew better. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and there was no escaping the truth. Brendan was charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and taken into custody. As he was escorted away, his face a mask of shock and anger, the community reeled from the news. The man they'd trusted, the man they'd thought they knew, was now the prime suspect in a horrifying crime. Brendan had gone from family man to accused murderer, and his double life was finally laid bare for all to see. As the case prepared to go to trial, both sides worked tirelessly to build their arguments. Brendan's defense team faced a nearly impossible task. They needed to find a way to cast doubt on the mountains of evidence against him. They combed through every piece of the case, searching for any angle that could weaken the prosecution's argument. The defense considered alternative theories, claiming that Juliana had acted alone or that Brendan had been manipulated. But the evidence, from the messages to the fingerprints, painted a damning picture. Meanwhile, the prosecution was confident. They'd built a meticulous case, carefully weaving together the forensic evidence, digital records, and Juliana's testimony into a narrative that left no room for doubt. Every text, every fingerprint, and every moment of Brendan's deception was presented in a way that illustrated the depths of his betrayal. The media covered every development, from pre-trial hearings to motions filed by both sides, fueling public curiosity and intensifying the scrutiny surrounding the case. As the trial date approached, tensions ran high. Family members, friends, and the community prepared to watch as the tragic story they'd been following for months played out in court. For Christine and Joe's loved ones, the trial was a chance to finally see justice served. For Brendan, it was his last shot at freedom. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, Juliana made a critical decision. She entered into a plea deal, pleading guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter in exchange for her testimony against Brendan. The plea deal was controversial, with some questioning whether she deserved a lighter sentence. But for the prosecution, Juliana's cooperation was invaluable. Her account of the events provided crucial details, filling in gaps and giving the jury a complete picture of the planning, the murder, and the aftermath. Juliana's testimony painted a disturbing portrait of Brendan as a controlling figure who had masterminded the plot, convincing her that eliminating Christine was the only way they could be together. She described in chilling detail how he'd persuaded her, planned each step, and manipulated her into believing they could get away with it. Her words held weight, and the prosecution knew that her testimony would be pivotal in securing a conviction. The plea deal meant a lighter sentence for Juliana, but it came at a cost. She would have to live with the knowledge of her role in Christine and Joe's deaths. As she prepared to testify, she knew she was about to face the consequences of her choices in a courtroom filled with people who would judge her. But Juliana was ready. She was determined to tell the truth, whatever the personal cost. As the trial began, Brendan's defense team scrambled to counter the overwhelming evidence against him. They attempted to poke holes in the prosecution's case, arguing that Juliana was an unreliable witness, that the forensic evidence was inconclusive, and that Brendan was being unfairly targeted. But their arguments felt thin, especially in light of Juliana's testimony and the digital records that documented Brendan's involvement. The defense tried to paint Brendan as a victim of manipulation, claiming that Juliana had orchestrated the crime and deceived him into going along with her plan. They argued that he had been seduced and misled, a pawn in Juliana's dangerous game. But the jury struggled to believe this narrative. The evidence showed a man who had meticulously planned his wife's murder, driven by a twisted obsession to be with his lover at any cost. The prosecution, meanwhile, laid out their case in a methodical, almost surgical manner. They called witnesses who described Brendan and Christine's marriage, forensic experts who explained the blood patterns and crime scene details, and digital analysts who walked the jury through Brendan's text messages and online searches. Piece by piece, the prosecution painted a clear, damning portrait of a man willing to sacrifice everything for his own desires. The courtroom was packed as the trial officially began, with opening statements from both sides. The prosecution wasted no time, describing Brendan's betrayal, the meticulous planning, and the cold-blooded murder that followed. They painted him as a man who had manipulated everyone around him, hiding his dark intentions beneath a facade of normalcy. The defense, meanwhile, insisted that Brendan was innocent, that he had been caught in a web spun by Juliana. But the evidence told a different story. As witnesses took the stand, the details became even clearer. Forensic experts explained how the evidence contradicted the story Brendan and Juliana had initially told. Friends and family members described Christine as a loving wife and mother, her life brutally cut short by someone she trusted. And when Juliana took the stand, her testimony was damning. She described Brendan's manipulation, the promises he'd made, and the pressure he'd put on her to go along with the plan. The courtroom was silent as Juliana described the moments leading up to Christine's murder, the chilling calmness with which Brendan had carried out the act, and the cold detachment he'd shown afterward. The jury listened closely, the weight of her words sinking in. With each piece of testimony, Brendan's chances grew slimmer, and the reality of his actions became harder to deny. As the trial continued, more details came to light, each revelation adding another layer to the story. Forensic evidence was presented that showed the precise, calculated nature of the crime. Detectives testified about Brendan's calm demeanor during questioning, his attempts to manipulate their perception, and his blatant lies when confronted with evidence. The prosecution emphasized that this was not a crime of passion, but a premeditated murder, planned down to the last detail. Perhaps the most powerful moments came from Christine's family, who shared emotional testimonies about the impact of her loss. They described a loving woman who had devoted her life to helping others, a mother and friend whose presence could never be replaced. Their grief was palpable, a reminder of the true cost of Brendan and Juliana's actions. As they spoke, the weight of Brendan's betrayal became painfully clear. The defense made one last attempt to sway the jury, calling character witnesses to vouch for Brendan's integrity and arguing that he'd been wrongfully accused. They tried to shift the blame onto Juliana, painting her as the real mastermind behind the plot. But the jury was unconvinced. The forensic evidence, the digital records, and Juliana's testimony created a story that was impossible to ignore. Brendan's defense was crumbling, and his fate seemed all but sealed. The prosecution's closing statement was powerful, a final summation that left no room for doubt. They reminded the jury of the overwhelming evidence, the twisted motivations, and the callous way Brendan had ended his wife's life. They urged the jury to remember Christine and Joe, innocent lives taken for the selfish desires of a man who thought he could get away with murder. The defense made a final plea for leniency, but it was clear where the jury's sympathies lay. The jury retreated to deliberate, reviewing the evidence and testimony in exhaustive detail. Hours passed as they discussed, debated, and analyzed every piece of the case. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces were somber. They'd reached a verdict that would change everything. Brendan was found guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted with emotion relief, sadness, and a sense of justice finally served. Brendan's face remained expressionless, the gravity of his actions fully setting in. He'd lost everything: his family, his freedom, his future. Justice had been served, but the scars he'd left behind could never be erased. The judge handed down a life sentence, ensuring Brendan would never walk free again. Juliana, having cooperated, received a lesser sentence, but would still face years behind bars. For both of them, the dreams they'd shared were now a distant, haunting memory. Their actions had brought nothing but destruction, a price they'd pay for the rest of their lives. The community struggled to come to terms with the tragedy, grappling with the knowledge that someone they'd trusted had been capable of such horror. Neighbors, friends, and family members were left to pick up the pieces, haunted by the betrayal and loss. Brendan's crime was a reminder that even those who seem trustworthy can harbor dark secrets. The story of Brendan Banfield and Juliana Peres Magalhães is a chilling reminder of how far people will go to hide their secrets and the devastation that betrayal can bring. What are your thoughts on this case? Share your reactions in the comments. If this story shocked you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and press the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content.